Welcome again, everyone. Thanks for attending. It's really exciting to be able to give this talk to a new audience, but we'll go ahead and get started. So next slide, please. So besides providing recognition for the longer history of the lands we occupy today, the acknowledgement of the transformation of people and land plays a key role in the story we'll be talking about today. Keep this in mind while we learn about the history of Eureka's Chinatown and the Chinese expulsion of 1885. I'll just read these quick land acknowledgements really fast. So Eureka's Chinatown occupies Wiyot territory. Eureka's Wiyot name is Jarujiji, which means where you sit and rest, as opposed to the settler notion of Eureka, I have found it. May we work to make this place one where we can all sit and rest safely while paying respect to those whose land we're on. And that was written by Chisato Hughes, who's one of our Eureka Chinatown team members. And then I'm actually broadcasting from the traditional territory of the Nisenan people near present-day Sacramento, California. So the Nisenan have been working to regain recognition as a federally recognized tribe for over a decade, along with working to regain some of their traditional lands. And you can learn more about them at nisenan.org. Next slide, please. So here are some of our goals for today. We'll be contextualizing Eureka's 1885 Chinese expulsion. We'll be providing an example of the historical legacy of forced removal in Northwestern California. And we'll also be exploring work happening to reinvestigate the personal histories of Eureka's Chinese residents and restore them to the historical record. Next slide, please. So to get things started, where in China were Eureka's Chinese residents coming from? So many of them came from Guangdong province, more specifically Taishan or Toisan, on the southern part of Guangdong on the South China Sea. This area also calls itself the first home of the overseas Chinese, as an estimated 500,000 Chinese Americans trace their roots to Toisan today, which is pretty impressive. Next slide, please. So looking at immigration, one way to understand this pretty complex situation is by looking at it as a push and pull phenomenon. So this doesn't capture the full complexities of immigration, such as things like personal free choice of the person migrating and their family connections to the place that they're migrating to. But it is a starting point to see how immigration functions on its most basic level, why someone would choose to leave a place to go somewhere else. So during the period where many of Eureka's Chinese residents were immigrating to the US, there was a lot going on in this Toisan area of China. During the period of 1851 to 1908, there was things like an ethnic war, 14 serious floods, 7 typhoons, 4 earthquakes, 2 severe droughts, 4 epidemics, and 5 great famines in that time period. So there's many reasons why people might have wanted to leave the area and go somewhere else. So the first recorded Chinese immigrant to Humboldt County actually dates from 1851, when a Chinese man moved to Trinidad, which is about a half-hour north of Eureka, and he worked there as a gardener. Next slide, please. So to understand why people were coming to California, and specifically Humboldt County, I'll give you some information on the background of Eureka, California. And that's where we'll be spending most of today. So Eureka is a small coastal town in Northern California. Once you get to San Francisco, in the modern day, if you continue to drive about 6 hours north, you'll end up in Eureka. It's an area known as being behind the so-called Redwood Curtain. Historically and presently, it's hard to get to. In the past, that had to do with shifting sandbars at the entrance to the bay, made it really dangerous for ships to get into the bay, so there would be a lot of shipwrecks. But then also overland routes had a lot of unstable hillsides, pretty dramatic weather in terms of rain and wind and things like that. Fallen trees, these are redwood trees we're talking about, so they could be 10 feet or more in diameter, and then additional difficulties in traveling. So these factors protected the area and its original inhabitants from colonization for centuries. This bay that Eureka sits beside is actually the largest bay between San Francisco and Portland, which you would think would make it a place that would be pretty populated pretty fast, but because of those sandbars blocking the area, as well as pretty dense fog, it left the area unsettled by Europeans until 1850. When Josiah Gregg and his traveling party arrived in the area, they were searching for a route to or from the Trinity gold fields to the ocean, so people could more easily travel and mine for gold, and also supplies delivery and things like that. The area we're looking at is the Old Town area of Eureka. So this is kind of the oldest settled area. It's also near where Chinatown was located. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, while transportation to the area was possible, it was pretty difficult and dangerous. And then once you were in Eureka, it was kind of hard to get much of anywhere quickly or at all, due to the pretty dense forests around town. Here's a picture from 1864. You can see those forests come right up to the side of town. And in many ways, despite these forests looking a little differently now, the isolation of the area still continues today. In the 1880s, the population was growing quickly as the economy was shifting from mining and mining supplies to logging massive redwood trees that seemed to extend eternally into the interior. So take a close look at this picture and then we'll see what the same scene looks like today. So next slide, please. Looks a little different. So now Eureka continues to extend pretty far inland now that those forests are no longer there. So next slide, please. So what were some of the additional drivers of immigration that brought people to California? A pull factor, of course, was the discovery of gold in the 1840s and 1850s in California. And that brought people into California from not only China, but from around the world. In 1848, gold was discovered inland from Eureka in the Trinity Mountains, and that attracted Chinese workers and miners and mule train workers to rapidly come into Eureka as it began growing in 1850. For many of these immigrants, the plan was to return back to China once they had made their riches, which explains partially why there were mostly young men who traveled to the United States rather than whole families, but we'll talk about that additionally. Some people decided to stay in the United States while others went back to China and others traveled between the two countries. And this continuing migration was greatly influenced by the US government and some other political events that happened as well. Next slide, please. So south of Eureka, down in San Francisco, there was also active recruitment of Chinese workers to work on the Central Pacific Railroad, which was the western side of the Transcontinental Railroad. Collis P. Huntington, who's pictured here on the right, was a big supporter of importing Chinese workers, along with Leland Stanford, who later became the governor of California and the founder of Stanford University. These railroad leaders and others found that Chinese workers were reliable, they were less likely to get sick, since many of the foods they ate and drank required boiled water, which killed off a lot of the waterborne diseases that other workers would pick up. They also had skills with dynamite and were less likely to skip out on the railroad company if gold was found nearby. Many of the other workers would just bail. And the use of Chinese workers, who were typically paid less than white workers, ended up making men like Huntington and Stanford and other railroad leaders a lot of money, and they became very wealthy because of that. These workers worked difficult and dangerous jobs. Many died in their line of work from workplace mishaps, disease, extreme weather, and more. But there's also numerous instances of organized strikes held by Chinese workers in protest of unsafe working conditions and these low wages and unfair labor practices. So after the railroad was completed, some workers returned to China while others found various work in towns along the railroad's path. They worked as maintenance workers on the railroad, and they would also move to other companies and continue expanding rail in the United States, using those skills that they gained from working on the Central Pacific. Now, it's pretty possible that some of these workers might have ended up working on the rail line that connected San Francisco to Eureka, and that's the Northwestern Pacific line. So there is a Humboldt connection there. Next slide, please. So the passage of the foreign miners tax in California, which happened in 1850, instilled a tax of $20 a month, or about $759 a month in 2022 dollars, on each miner who is not a free white person or a citizen of the United States. Many of those people were Chinese immigrants, but also Latino miners in that same camp. This pushed many miners out of the gold fields and into nearby towns like Eureka, Trinidad, and Arcata, which are two other nearby towns. As surface gold dried up, miners moved out of the gold fields looking for better paying work, and they'd oftentimes end up in these towns. They were oftentimes given the lowest paid, difficult, or menial work around, but some did move into the merchant class and supplied growing Chinese and white populations with goods imported from China, and we'll look at that. In Eureka, we have evidence of multiple Chinese merchants along with fishermen, laundry workers, and owners. Railroad construction, like I talked about, road building, servant work, cooks in town at various businesses, but also at things like logging cookhouses. They also worked in those lumber camps outside of town, and there were also farmers. Approximately 11 Chinese-owned businesses can be positively identified from an 1884 map of Old Town Eureka. And in 1886, over 50 merchants attempted to sue the city for losses from the 1885 expulsion. Next slide, please. So popular pursuit for some of these workers were to create and manage what's known as truck gardens on the outskirts of town, and they would raise vegetables, fruit, and livestock to supply Eureka with fresh produce and meat. It's reasonable to believe that some Chinese residents might have lived near these gardens as well. And the gardens have been noted to have existed about a mile outside of town and sometimes even further. And that's pretty significant. At the time, there were only about 3,000 people that lived in Eureka, and surveyed maps of insured buildings only went about 5 blocks inland from the bay. So you might imagine the walk that it would be to get those goods to market. So next slide, please. So one thing that's important to talk about too is talking about wages. So how much money were Chinese workers making in their various jobs, and how did it compare to the other people in the area? So we don't have this data specifically for Eureka, but we have it for parts of California, which is reproduced here. If you look at this chart, you can see the pay rates in 1884 money and the conversion to 2021 dollars for Chinese workers on the left side and for white workers on the right. The highest paying Chinese job was a brick maker, and they maxed out at about half of what the unskilled white worker might make in a month. Next slide, please. So let's take a look at the Chinese population also. During the expulsion event, news stories oscillated between there being 200 or 300 Chinese residents in Eureka who were removed during the expulsion. And that would be about 10% of the population of Eureka at the time. The chart here shows the populations of Chinese residents in 1860, 70, and 80 through the census records. It's important to note that the census probably undercounts these populations. Many of the people might have been outside of the actual town area when the census was happening. There's lots of discrepancies that would happen to when the census workers would be trying to record Chinese residents as well. And from some newspaper articles too, we can see that some of the residents who were removed during the 1885 expulsion actually weren't living in Eureka. They might have just been in town for the day and just were not there at the right time. But you can see the pretty significant growth in the Chinese population here from 37 people in 1860 to 241 in 1880. Next slide, please. Now let's take a look at the physical site of Chinatown. So this is actually the modern day Google Street View of the intersection of 4th and E Street looking towards F Street. This piece of road is actually the modern day Highway 101 going through downtown, and the bay is about 4 blocks to the left of this picture. Now, next slide, please. Now we'll take a closer look at where this red circle is at, and the next slide, please. So this is that same street view over 130 years before the present and colorized using AI software. The Chinatown core is located on the right side of this image. However, there's additional Chinese businesses outside, and they appear kind of on the left side of the image too. But we'll take closer looks at this picture. Next slide, please. So while not all of the Chinese workers in Eureka lived in Chinatown, as we discussed, it was a major hub for social and economic lives of the Chinese residents. Here's an example of an ad that was placed in a local paper by a Chinese merchant who operated his business called Kang Hop Company. He was selling both general supplies and specialty Chinese and Japanese imports. Now, Chinatown served as a place for the retention of culture and language for Chinese residents, and multiple local newspaper reports specifically cover festivities related to Lunar New Year in the Chinatown area. But Chinatown also had the opportunity to be a place for intercultural interactions, as shown by this ad, which is an English ad in an English language local newspaper. Other local newspaper stories also document interactions such as women going into opium dens, which the stories in the papers were usually serving as reasons why Chinese residents should be removed. But the stories do illustrate potential cross-cultural interactions between white and Chinese residents that extend outside of going to stores and things like that. Another story was found in the diary of Reverend Huntington, who was the leader of a nearby church, and it details how he had a student who was a young Chinese man, and how this young man came to say goodbye to him when the expulsion was in progress. Examples of Chinese-owned and operated businesses also illustrate the presence of Chinese workers outside of Chinatown, working in industries from laundry to shingle making, fishing, farming, and many more. Next slide, please. So while the activities of Chinese residents in Chinatown, things like the operation of laundries and various businesses, but also opium dens and seasonal celebrations like Lunar New Year, these activities were greatly criticized in local English-speaking newspapers in the years leading up to 1885. But activities that filled similar roles also took place on nearby 2 Street, which is also known as 2nd Street in Eureka. The 2 Street area was chock full of bars and brothels serving miners in from the mines, loggers down from the forests, and a variety of other people passing through the area. And violence wasn't unusual. It was a pretty Wild West kind of area. I've heard a couple stories, like one when they pulled up the wooden sidewalks in Eureka, they found multiple old handguns that had just kind of been tossed under there. And then during the restoration of one of the buildings, when they went to strip the paint off the walls, the wooden walls, they found a spray of buckshot at about head height embedded in the wall. And then there's also local apothecaries and doctors that supplied all kinds of opium products to people. Laudanum was a really common one. It's opium in liquid form. And that was prescribed for almost any ailment from insanity to cramps. If you had a problem, they said opium could fix it. But infusions and pill forms were also used as well by many of the white residents in Eureka. And then there's also stories of noisy activities like anvil blasting, where they'd take an anvil, they'd put some gunpowder on it, and then they'd put another one on top, and then they would light it and it would shoot the anvil into the air during things like 4th of July. So it was a pretty noisy area as well. Next slide, please. So while gunfights and other chaotic activities around 2 Street did make the papers, they didn't have the same racially charged biases that articles about Chinese residents at the same time had. This is an example of that from an article that came out the day before the expulsion happened. And the article reads, "The people of Chinatown know that, or the people of Eureka know that Chinatown is the pestilential quarter where Chinese gambling dens, opium smoking hellholes, and the lowest brothels abound." So it's pretty charged, and you can see that there. Next slide, please. So Chinatown did serve as a cultural hub, and it was home to some of the Chinese residents of Eureka. Chinatown served as a place where residents could share familiar foods, customs, holidays, language, community ties. It was also a place of protection from the Eureka population, which was becoming more violent towards the Chinese residents. It started out as people kind of staring rudely across the street, but also things like throwing rocks and sometimes even murders. In other parts of the county, as well as in Eureka, newspapers would sometimes report Chinese residents being shot and robbed, and no suspects were ever captured from those crimes. In a time where it was becoming harder or even impossible for Chinese residents to speak out against white residents in court, there was a court case called People v. Hall, which was a California Supreme Court case in 1854 that made it illegal for them to speak out. It's not extreme to consider that living together with people of a similar cultural background could be a way to stay safe physically, but it also likely lessened feelings of isolation and loneliness, being able to interact with and live with people of a similar background. It was really hard for the Chinese residents to fit this kind of understanding of what whiteness and the status quo was. So that was also kind of an isolating factor that brought people together. Additionally, we know of no land locally that was owned by Chinese residents outright. All the land records we've been able to find, including the ones on the site of Chinatown itself, were all rented properties that were usually owned by wealthy individuals like John Vance, who was later the mayor of Eureka, but made most of his money running various timber operations. But then there was also C.S. Ricks, who owned a few properties and businesses around town, along with the property that Chinatown itself was on. It can be guessed that another reason for Chinatown developing in this particular site is that it might have been a cost-saving measure, and it was a place to live that was already known to allow Chinese tenants. Next slide, please. So these are some close-up images of the built environment of Chinatown. They're old pictures, so they're a little blurry. But you can see that the buildings are made out of scrap timber, which would have probably been picked up at the various mills around town. There's also raised wooden sidewalks, which you can kind of see in the middle picture there. And all of these buildings are located along a packed dirt road. And you can imagine what it might have been like to cross this road during a major rainstorm. This is an area that would get about 45 inches of rain, or a little over a meter of rain a year. So you can imagine it might be a little dicey trying to get across that street. Next slide, please. So here's that picture again. You can see the packed dirt road more zoomed out. You can see the road is on a downhill slope. So Eureka slopes from downward from the east towards the northwest, towards the bay. And that's going to be an important part of our story. Next slide, please. So this is a map we'll continue to come back to, but you can see how there's a gray area right in the middle there that's labeled as swampy, right alongside a creek. The blocks of Chinatown are bounded in red too, so you can see that swampy area goes right through Chinatown. Some descriptions of this area say it's swampy because of a slough or a bay inlet or just a really full creek. The description that we've also seen is from 1907. There was a story about Ulysses S. Grant, who later became a US president. And he was stationed in Fort Humboldt, which is just down the way from Eureka. And he was walking down the road in 1854, and there was the slough there. He walked across a fallen log, and it was rainy and slippery, so he fell in the slough and got drenched. It's kind of an interesting story. Now, next slide, please. So there was a time when this road was graded by the city of Eureka, and what ended up happening was it lifted the road up just enough that natural drainage ended up being blocked. So that caused some issues in the actual site of Chinatown. And this was also a time when indoor plumbing wasn't much of a thing, so there's kind of some compounding issues here. Next slide, please. So this is an account of what Chinatown looked like. This was written in 1910, so this was after, far after the 1885 expulsion. There would be these articles that would come out on the anniversary of the expulsion, kind of retelling the story. And this one talks about a pond that had formed behind Chinatown due to the grading of that street. And it was described as a, quote, the receptacle of all filth and nastiness that could accumulate. There's that continuing pretty harsh tone of these articles as well. And these kinds of sentiments, which dated back to 1880s, began to color how the Chinese residents were viewed. And these living conditions that were described in 1910, but also back in the 1880s, played into existing stereotypes around health and hygiene that were being widely publicized through other far-reaching publications like The Wasp from San Francisco, which by 1876 was the most widely read weekly on the West Coast. And it was well known for its evocative political cartoons, which you've probably seen. If you haven't heard of the name of the paper, you've probably seen the cartoons. So next slide, please. So this is an example of one of those cartoons. It's attributing diseases like smallpox, along with personal characteristics like selfishness and immorality, to immigrants, specifically Chinese immigrants in this case. And with the circulation that the publications like the WASP had, these could reach into rural places like Eureka due to improving technology around telegraphs, around trains and boats and things like that, getting this information from where they were being produced in places like San Francisco out to rural outposts like Eureka. These stereotypes began coloring the local media's perspective on Chinese immigrants living in the area. And we start seeing these sentiments popping up in local newspapers in the months and years leading up to February 1885. Next slide, please. The serialization of news articles, so republishing them from one paper to the other, and the quick transformation or transportation of information over telegraph lines began expanding those stereotypes. And so these are some examples of that, stories about the Chinese events happening in Eureka being republished in places like Chico, for instance. Next slide, please. So we'll kind of zoom out a little bit. We'll take a look at the larger regional and national political forces that influenced the events of February 1885 in Eureka. As I mentioned, justice for Chinese residents in the United States was subpar, and various forces within the US economic and political sphere began worsening things for Chinese residents in the US through the end of the 1800s. We talked about 1863, the court case in California that banned Chinese residents from testifying against white people in court. That law actually was replicated in places like Arizona and many other states in 1865. And then over the next 20 years, laws and legal cases continued to restrict Chinese residents' rights in the United States. So I'll be throwing down some dates here. Don't worry, you don't have to take notes. There won't be a test at the end. Next slide, please. So 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad is completed. Many Chinese workers, leave the railroad and they begin looking for work in the middle of an economic recession. And what begins happening is that there's various labor unions that begin to blame the Chinese residents for the recession itself, but the actual recession was caused more by bank failure, fraud, and speculation related to railroad work. So it wasn't actually the Chinese workers themselves, it was who was organizing the railroads. Next slide, please. We get to 1875, the Page Act severely curtailed the immigration of foreign workers, but was primarily enforced against Chinese workers and specifically women by prohibiting labor recruitment from China, Japan, or in the Act's words, any Oriental country. It had the secondary result of curbing the growth of Chinese families in the United States. If there were no women coming to the area, you couldn't necessarily have families. So this also made it harder for Chinese residents to become citizens, because at the time, really the only time a Chinese person could become a citizen was if they were born in the United States. And if there weren't women, that wasn't really happening. So then in 1880, the Angel Treaty amended the Burlingame Treaty. That original treaty, the Burlingame Treaty, was made to open friendly relations with the US and China, and that allowed Chinese immigration to start. And then the amendment in 1880 was a 180-degree turn from that original treaty, and it allowed the US to suspend Chinese immigration. That move went further in 1882 with the Chinese Exclusion Act, which banned Chinese individuals from becoming citizens, and was the first and only law to prevent anyone of a certain country from entering the United States. And it caused issues for Chinese residents who had returned to China, but were trying to get back to the US, or so forth. And it caused all kinds of legal red tape. In 1892, it was strengthened with the Geary Act, made permanent in 1902. And there were some exemptions. Diplomats, teachers, students, merchants, and travelers could still come to the US under limited circumstances. And that remained the law until 1942. And then it was officially taken out in 1965, which is pretty incredible. It lasted that long. Next slide, please. So the economic state, we kind of touched on a little bit. The economic state of the United States and the West is a very key part of this story. It's well documented that anti-immigrant sentiment rises during times of economic depression or recession. good paying jobs become more scarce, employers can pay less, and competition increases for jobs that are becoming lower paid. In this time period, actions by white residents against Chinese residents included boycotts of Chinese businesses or businesses that employed Chinese workers, and would eventually escalate to acts of violence such as burning homes, destroying infrastructure, or murder. Organized labor would support anti-Chinese actions to protect union workers from that perceived undercutting action of Chinese labor being cheaper than white labor. However, there was kind of this division already of labor where there were certain jobs that white workers just wouldn't do and Chinese workers would do. So they weren't necessarily competing for the same jobs, but there were newspapers and politicians and unions that ended up kind of pushing that story anyway and proclaimed that Chinese people were taking white jobs. So anti-Chinese movements continued to grow into things like the Anti-Chinese League. They began holding huge conventions. They would begin to influence the political developments in regions, especially in the West. The Republican and Democratic parties hopped on the bandwagon, and they had anti-Chinese platforms as well. And that formed those rules from becoming into larger regional and even national laws, as we discussed. Next slide, please. So the effects of capitalism and the race-based hierarchy it creates should not be understated when it comes to events like Eureka's Chinatown and the Chinese expulsion. The growth of anti-Chinese sentiment served as a rallying cry that deflected the anger and fear of white workers away from their capitalist employers, who were actually negatively affecting the economy, and towards their more vulnerable target, which were the Chinese immigrants. Meanwhile, the larger employers continued to cause serious economic and environmental issues that down the road made reliable and safe employment more difficult to come by for everyone. So when the individual workers couldn't go after the large and powerful companies and owners, the workers teamed up as unions and communities and went after Chinese workers instead, who were only tangentially related, but more visible, easily identifiable, and legally vulnerable. Next slide, please. So while we were talking about how vulnerable these Chinese workers are legally, they still took steps to protect themselves and push back against anti-Chinese events happening around them. There's a case called Hum Lai et al. Versus Baldwin that was filed by 132 Chinese merchants in Butte, Montana. There was a boycott taking place against Chinese shops in 1896. The merchants did actually end up winning that case, and they got payment for their losses, and the union was ordered to stop the boycott. With all this in mind, let's head back to Eureka and let's get to 1885. Next slide, please. All right. So now it's the evening of February 6th, 1885. It's likely cold and damp. Eureka's in the middle of a recession like everyone else in the country. So there's idle people kind of hanging around. It's a Saturday, so there's probably people in town looking for things to do. They might be spending their week's earnings in the bars and the brothels and things like that. There's a scuffle that happens near Chinatown. There's many stories later down the road that try to explain what actually happened, but shots ring out. And Councilman David Kendall, who's pictured here on the left, was walking down the street near Chinatown, and he's accidentally shot. So he hits the ground, someone carries him back to his house, and he dies shortly thereafter. Within a few minutes of Kendall hitting the ground, a mob of Eurekans assembles at Centennial Hall, which is just outside of Chinatown. There's some reports that number the attendees in the hundreds. The National Guard is actually called out to ensure peace, and that's the first time that the National Guard is called out in Eureka. A group of Chinese men, the shooter supposedly among them, is rounded up and carted off to the local jail, and they're booked for a few weeks before ultimately being released in May. Here's that map again that kind of points out some of those locations. This is an 1886 Sanborn Fire Insurance map, and the buildings in yellow are wooden. So next slide, please. At the Centennial Hall meeting, the mob proposes all kinds of different solutions to what's been popularly dubbed the Chinese problem. There were protests at this meeting by the local pastor I mentioned earlier, Reverend Huntington, and he was urging against violence directed at the Chinese community, saying, why should we blame everyone for the actions of one or two people? But that suggestion is kind of shrugged off. People begin throwing out other ideas. Somebody proposes burning Chinatown to the ground with all the residents inside. But the threat of the fire escaping and burning down all of Eureka, which is a town consisting mostly of wooden buildings, and a rudimentary fire suppression system, it was a very real possible problem. So that ended up being taken off the table. It was eventually decided that a committee of 15 made up of some of the most influential men in Eureka would be coming up with a solution. That solution ended up being the so-called nonviolent forced removal of all Chinese residents from Eureka within 24 hours. All residents were ordered to pack their things and be at the docks to catch ships to San Francisco. As a threat, a gallows was also constructed, threatening the hanging of any Chinese resident who remained once the ships had sailed. Next slide, please. So the residents pack up what they can and they carry all their things to the docks, which are pictured here in the 1886 Sanborn map. The residents stayed at the warehouse on the docks until the ships were able to load them and their items and sail towards San Francisco. And these images depict approximately where those warehouses were. We actually don't know exactly where they're at, but this is probably where they're at. Next slide, please. So in the lead up to the expulsion and then even afterwards, many articles in the newspaper are highlighting the temporary nature of Chinese residents being in Eureka. But then there's this quote, also from the local paper, that refutes that common stereotype. 4 of the passengers were Chinese merchants who had lived from 10 to 14 years in Eureka. Next slide, please. The details that we know about the events of 1885 come from mainly white produced sources, newspapers, and a diary by Reverend Huntington. The only Chinese sources or items that were picked up at the site of Chinatown after the expulsion, like this clay pot, which is the item that actually kicked off my research into this event, but other items as well that show up at places like the Clark Museum, being donated by descendants of the people who took them out of Chinatown. There's missing documentation frequently about who owned these items prior to the expulsion and how they were used, but we can use various institutional records like the census, mortuary records, maps, and court case documents to fill in some of those details about the community. Next slide, please. In the days and months to follow, there's many different theories that surface as to why a gunfight took place near Eureka's Chinatown. This is one from the Humboldt Times, which is kind of interesting. It names a criminal named Adam Quinn who came to town to collect money from blackmailers in Eureka. Some reports do mention that leaders in the Chinese community had been warning of impending violence, but the local police had not done anything to mitigate that. And the papers, report regularly on gunfights, and they kind of start saying, there's an increase in gunfights going on around here. But we might not ever actually know why this shooting took place. There's all sorts of different ideas around what caused it. This particular account, though, it also includes some blame on white residents for dragging out the conflict, which I haven't seen in other accounts. So it brings up lots of questions. Next slide, please. So we might never know the full truth of what happened, but we can still ask questions about the things that we do see. There's reports like this where there were 2 of the passengers who were shipped to San Francisco who were severely wounded. One had been shot in the leg and the arm, and the other one had been shot in the leg. The papers after the fact, tout this as a nonviolent expulsion, but you're looking at people accidentally being shot in the extremities when they might have been running away. You see things like that. It makes you ask some questions. But regardless, the emotional and mental injuries sustained through forced removal are themselves a psychological violence that can impact someone for the rest of their lives. And it makes you wonder what these people experienced and then how their lives rolled out after that. Next slide, please. A lot of these newspaper stories just kind of end with the Chinese residents went on to ships. They were sent down to San Francisco, and that was it. There were no Chinese people in Humboldt County until Ben Chin in the 1950s. The papers, as time goes on, just continues to reiterate that story. But we do actually know that there was resistance, maybe not directly during the expulsion itself, but afterwards. And that resistance shows up in a couple different ways. Next slide, please. Upon arriving in San Francisco, 54 Chinese residents, including 2 women, came together to file the Hing versus the City of Eureka court case, and that was with the help of the Chinese 6 companies. The full document, you can actually view it through Cal Poly Humboldt's Humboldt Room. It outlines the name of each plaintiff, the amount they're claiming they lost, and some of the other additional information. And the court case is recorded on pre-printed forms. Next slide, please. The Chinese 6 companies is nowadays known as the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association. It has somewhat murky beginnings, but their purpose was to help support new Chinese immigrants to immigrating to the US. They got settled in and they would help them thrive. In the earlier years of Chinese immigration to the US, before a Chinese consulate was established, the 6 companies also served in kind of a quasi-governmental way. As anti-Chinese sentiments grew, the 6 companies frequently paid lawyers to represent Chinese immigrants in court cases surrounding their rights as immigrants from China. Frequently in the white media, the 6 companies was portrayed as a slaveholding company or some kind of criminal mafia-like gang that held power over all Chinese immigrants, but that was not really the case. 2 lawyers were frequently used by the Chinese 6 companies, and they participated in the Hing case. And those lawyers are named Hall McAllister and Thomas Riordan. Both were incredibly skilled lawyers and were very well known in their time. However, some of them don't actually have a lot of information about their work with the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association. Riordan, for instance, there's like 2 newspaper articles about him, and that's about it, which is pretty crazy to think of. Next slide, please. So the court case documents are made up by filings made by the Chinese representatives, and then the rebuttals by the city of Eureka, who was being represented by a guy named Silas M. Buck. Near the middle of the Hing court documents, you see pages like this, which are the city's rebuttal against the Chinese claims of being forcefully removed. There's some sections that are crossed out, which is kind of interesting. That section that's crossed out here says that the city did not forcibly drive Chinese people and their businesses out of the city. Next slide, please. But you can see in this and many, many other papers that are published, it's open that there was a driving out that happened. So statements like the city didn't drive people out had to be crossed out. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, the case was actually thrown out due to the 1870 Naturalization Act, which excluded, quote, any aliens ineligible for citizenship, end quote, from owning property, specifically land. At the time, that included the Chinese residents, but also Japanese immigrants, as well as many others. The judge that was hearing the case ruled that the Chinese could not sue for property, specifically land, which they didn't own, so the case was thrown out. This particular ruling was really big. Papers like the Inyo Independent, which was hundreds of miles from Humboldt County, reported on the case. And because the judge took this really narrow view and he wasn't looking at personal belongings or movable property, that was a really important aspect of the case. So in turn, the city was not actually liable to pay the Chinese for their losses, including, businesses left behind, anything they couldn't carry to the docks or sell in 24 hours. They lost out on all of that. This court case, since it was widely published, ended up kind of assisting in the reproduction of this same method where there'd be a committee of 15. They would say, okay, all the Chinese residents have to be out by this date. And that event is replicated in various parts of California, but also the West. And it's touted as the Eureka Plan. And in other places, things like the actual burning of the Chinatown buildings would happen as well, to ensure that the residents would not come back. So while the court case was definitely a loss for the Chinese immigrants in Eureka and elsewhere, it ends up helping us to have a better idea of who was living in Eureka, these Chinese residents, and what their lives in Eureka were like. And it demonstrates also a really good case study in how Chinese residents worked through the legal system to secure their rights, even if in this case, it was not successful. Next slide, please. So we talked about Kang Hop a little bit earlier. Here's an arrow pointing to approximately where his shop is located. Kang Hop actually shows up in the Hing documents. So when I paired the Hing documents, this newspaper article, and the census together, it creates a really good picture of at least one of these Chinese residents. Next slide, please. So at the top is the census record, at the bottom is part of the Hing court case. So Kang Hop was a 57-year-old man who was originally from Canton. Now it's Guangzhou. And in the census record, it lists him as keeping store, but then there's also two other people in his household, Tom Hua and Tom Sing Tao. Tom Hua is 21, he's a laborer, also from the same area as Kang Hop. And then there's Tom Sing Tao, 19, and he is a storekeeper. So he's helping out Kang Hop is kind of the understanding here. And then when we look at Kang Hop's losses, combined the losses were about $13,000 for Kang Hop himself and his store. If you convert that to today's money, it's almost $400,000. So you can draw kind of a couple conclusions from this. His business was successful. He might have been supplying, people out in the backcountry, perhaps. They might have been sending goods out that way, which was a really big moneymaker at the time. There might have been goods that were purchased on credit, and because of the expulsion that happened, he wasn't able to collect that money in credit, so he ended up losing out on that. These could have been losses for the development of the building that his shop was in. It could have been for, stock that was lost, all kinds of things like that. So it's still a pretty murky picture, but it's more than what we had previous. And there's a lot more work that can be done with these census records and the Hing court case, and trying to match people up to better understand their stories. Next slide, please. So I took this information from Kang Hop and then some other people I found in the census records, but also these 1884 maps, and worked with a program called History Pin to place images, but also information in like a geo-referenced format using this program. And you might actually have to hit the next slide button for this. Oh, okay, never mind, it didn't work. Okay, so on the previous slide, there was a short little video clip of taking one of these street images, like the one behind me, and putting it in front of a present day street view. So you can actually click and drag, and you can see how the street view changed over time. So another one of these history pins is what they're called. I took the Belcher map, so this 1884 map, and paired it with a newspaper article that talks about Chinese wash houses that were located right near the bay on land owned by John Vance. So this is another example of one of those history pins. I'm hoping to add more to this site as I continue to collect information using the census records and the maps and the newspapers and everything else to geo-reference these events in a differently accessible way than what we've done before. So next slide, please. So as time passes after historical events, stories are generated, and the Chinese expulsion is no exception to that. Each year around the anniversary of the expulsion, other towns were encouraged to remove their Chinese populations, and the anniversary was celebrated in these newspapers. And then there were additional updates to new expulsions that had happened in places like Arcata and Trinidad and Petrolia. And then in these stories too, though, there's these little details that pop out. And because newspaper articles at the time didn't really cite their sources, you don't really know if this was something someone embellished or if this was like a new detail that came out. One of the common stories that comes out in these later retellings is of Charlie Moon, the story of Charlie Moon. So next slide, please. So while after 1885, there's, people are touting Humboldt County, the only county in California without any Chinese people, many of the stories kind of have a footnote mentioning this guy, Charlie Moon. So the story goes is that he was allowed to stay because he was Americanized. He worked for a white landowner, Tom Bear, out of his ranch on Redwood Creek. And the story goes is Charlie Moon was in his about 20s when the expulsion happened in Eureka, and there was a group of men that came up from Eureka and said, Tom Bear, we know you have a Chinese man working for you, and we're here to take him to Eureka and send him down to San Francisco. And the story goes is that Tom Bear picks up a shotgun and says, you got to get through me first. And the men say, okay, okay, and they leave. Charlie Moon ended up working for the Bear family for many, many decades. He married a local Native woman, and they had 8 or 9 kids. Tom Bear's family also deeded him a section of their property, so he had his own house and his family could live there. And since he had so many kids, there's a lot of Moon descendants in Humboldt County. So it's not unusual to see the Moon name all over the place in Humboldt County. And we do walking tours of Eureka's Chinatown, and it's not unusual to have at least one Moon family member, sometimes even a Bear family member, show up on the tour. Next slide, please. And this myth of Charlie Moon being the last Chinese man in the county ran throughout his entire life, as these newspaper stories would come up, especially in his obituaries. And even in the obituaries is the perpetuation of some of these myths about the expulsion, calling it a Tong uprising, as opposed to a forced expulsion. And these articles, like the other ones, continue to color people's perceptions of the expulsion today as well. You know, this article was published in 1943, so those stories continued. Next slide, please. So working with the Eureka Chinatown project, we've had many discussions about how this story is impacting people today. Many people in the Chinatown project have shared stories of visiting friends or family in the Bay Area, for instance, and the friends or family saying, don't say you're from Eureka. It's going to change how people treat you. They might refuse you service. They might get very upset. They might ask you to leave. We've also spoken with parents who were moving their kids up to Humboldt County to go to school and kind of started looking into, the history of the area. And they're kind of like, ooh, there was this expulsion that happened. There's not a lot of kids that look like my kid who is, Asian American. This is kind of concerning. So these continue to impact how Humboldt County is evolving demographically today. When you look at the demographics of Humboldt County's population of Asian American, Pacific Islander, and Native Hawaiians, it's only about 3.4% of the population is in that demographic group. But when you look at California's overall, it's about 16.4%. That's a pretty substantial difference. And it's taken a long time to get to the point where there's, a critical mass of people that are trying to do something to address this history. And that's what the Eureka Chinatown project has partially been doing. Next slide, please. So the project's done a couple things so far, and there's many other things in the works, but we've put up interpretive signage at the site of Chinatown. And then there's also this fabulous mural called Fowl, which if you want to learn more about it, you can look up Eureka Chinatown project. And there's more information on that. But we're also inviting people to do walking tours, and we're continuing to come up with ideas for physical monuments and memorials in the area to put the Chinese story back on the landscape after it's been removed for so long. There's a robust educational program that goes along with it. We're working on a curriculum for local schools and things like that. But besides putting physical things on the landscape, I think one of the most powerful aspects of this project is it's not necessarily seen, but it's felt. Discussing the expulsion with members of the community on the tours has been really powerful, and participants are making connections with one another as they're trying to process this information and understand how there's connections between 1885 and 2022. And I think it's building a type of cross-racial and cross-class solidarity within the Eureka community, but also Humboldt County. And I think it's fundamentally improving the community's sense of identity and camaraderie. It opens conversations that are informative, empowering, and enriching. So one last thing I'll share is the next slide, please. So our second ever group tour was for members of the Moon family specifically, and this is only a small section of that family. These are the ones who could get out to town, and their family story that they shared with us when we went on this tour, and we had a discussion afterwards. It touches on so many parts of the history of Humboldt County. You know, talking about the Native American communities who have been here, who have survived genocide, and then also the immigrant communities that came here and developed the area. And then were later, in the Chinese case, discarded after the intensive work that they did to develop the area. So despite that, there's a lot of pride in this family as well. You know, for many, many years, it was a story that they kind of had to keep contained, that they were not only Native American, but they were also Chinese and of this mixed race heritage. And for a long time, it was dangerous to be out about that. But now, there's been, for instance, the dedication of Charlie Moon Way, which was an event that happened in May. That was an opportunity for us to honor their family, honor their story, and place another landmark in the development of relations in this county. And it's been really, really meaningful to participate in this project. And while it is a story, the Chinatown story is a story of fear and loss, but it's also hope and resistance that we're working on sharing with a larger audience. And it's inspiring other communities to do work as well. And over in Red Bluff, there's the Chu family that are working to put landmarks on in the town of Red Bluff, acknowledging the contributions of their family. But then also, we've received recognition from like the Los Angeles Times has done a report on this, and various other outlets. So it's a story that's catching on, and Eureka is really only the beginning. So thank you for participating with us today, and I think I'll turn it over to